Yeah, hello listeners. I'm Trevor Meding. Originally grew up in Canada, Alberta, close to the Rocky Mountains. Been living working in Texas, the Sugarland area, Houston, for the last 5 years. I've been running ultra marathons for about 7 years now. Um, love long distances, which sort of leads us to here. Is I just finished and ran the Tahoe 200.
Yeah, 200 miles. It's insane, man. So you grew up in Canada, and
Correct.
what
Yep.
had you come to America?
So work brought me down. I work in oil service industry and opportunity came up to move down to the Houston area. My wife is American. So I always sort of wanted to move closer, sort of between the families. So the opportunity came up a few years ago and here we are.
Sweet. I was looking through your results and all of the very impressive feats you've done. I mean, you've done tons of 100 milers, 200-mile races, just tons of trail and ultra marathons. I think out of all my guests, you have the most big races I've ever seen, which is very impressive. So I want to know. I like to hear origin stories. Where did this trail and ultra running thing begin? Can you take us back to that?
Yeah, I mean, I got interested in sort of not being lazy. I guess you could call it sort of a quote unquote midlife crisis or thought check back in 2016, and I decided to sign up for a half marathon on the road. I didn't even know trail runs existed at that point, but I ran a half marathon. I trained for a few months before it and completed it. I enjoyed the running part, which I never thought I might prior because I just randomly ran before that, not anything serious. And then, yeah, I did, I think, two half marathons before I discovered there were some trail marathons. I was talking to people after the finish, and they pointed me to this small trail series, and then I did a race with that trail series, and then I realized I'm never going back to the roads again because that was
Mm.
the trails just got me hooked instantly when I think I basically did like a half marathon trail race there, and
Yeah.
then a couple of the short ones there, and then I realized people run long distances on the trail, and so I signed up for my first trail race 6 months after running my first half marathon, and I was or my first trail ultra 6 months after my first half marathon, and from there just took off. As you can see by my bio, I dislike training. I like racing, so I sort of stacked them on one of each other. I'm not very traditional that way.
Mm. Interesting. What? So I want to go back a little bit. What was it about the trails that intrigued you so much compared to road racing?
I think honestly, it's just being outside and sort of the sense of adventure. I'm more of a an introvert and someone who does things like solo, like a lot of us ultra runners do. Find ourselves out there a long time just doing training miles solo or just out on these adventures by ourselves and just being out in nature. And it sort of reminded me as a kid playing outside, um, just being in this cool area and exploring new places.
Interesting. Yeah. So you found this whole trail running thing and you really liked it. And then you started to find these bigger distances. What what drew you to these bigger distances?
I think just seeing if it was um, possible. Because like I started, I've always been somewhat athletic, but I was never really in shape until I started running a little bit. And I saw these people were doing amazing things, and then I learned these people run 100 miles, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. I was like, "What? How?" I'm pushing hard and barely getting around these trail half marathons, and like sometimes 2, 3 hours on a hard course, and it's like, how do they even do this?
Yeah.
And so I think it was just like a far stretch goal at the time, which just sounded amazing, which which is what led me to sign up for my first 100-mile race less than 1 year after I started running.
Wow. So your curiosity about these 100-mile races are what brought you in.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
in 1 year, 1 year you signed up for a 100-mile race. Did you finish the 100-mile race?
I did. It was a very small one, um, but sort of local grassroots. I think there's only like 12 people that started it, but it was a local race there, and I didn't know anything about being competitive or anything. I just wanted to go and finish it, and that's what that was my goal. And yeah, I managed to get around, and it was an amazing adventure. And sort
So,
of getting there and finishing it just sort of grew that stoke for, yeah, I want to do that again.
mm, so you did these 50Ks and then you ran this Summer River Valley 100-mile race, which you just spoke of. Um,
Yep, correct. Yeah.
I don't know how clear your memory is of that, which I'm sure it's very clear. Um, when during that race, how did your body react with only 1 year under your belt? What was the pain and mental barriers like?
Hmm. Uh, well, it was definitely painful. Probably being, obviously that was the longest time on my feet by far at that point. I think I did 100K before that, but yeah, it was by far the biggest distance I'd done. I trained pretty well up to it, trying to get as much volume as I could, but I'm self-coached. I had no formal structure, but yeah, I think just the painfulness of that and probably the surprisingness of the sleep deprivation for the first time running a full night. Um, Obviously stayed up a few nights in my life as a younger adult and stuff,
Yeah.
but not when you're running. So
What's it
that's always a
like? What's
tricky
that
thing to
like?
learn.
What's that like running with sleep deprivation? And obviously, like we'll talk about Tahoe here in a minute, but just in general with all the ultras you've done, what's that like running with little to no sleep?
Well, as you get into the longer distances, like these 200s that I've recently got into, I mean, even 100 milers or some of the tough mountain hundreds, people are going to experience sleep issues. But I think it's just learning to listen to your own body and knowing when and if you actually need sleep, opposed to just sort of being more of a little bit of a mental fatigue where you can get over it with some caffeine or just regular nutrition and calories, which usually fixes it 90% of the time. It's usually you don't eat enough or don't drink enough, and your body's like, okay, time to sleep.
Yeah, I got you. Cool, man. I was just curious on that. Personally, I have yet to actually run through a whole night with no sleep, so it's still on my to-do list. Um, but that's cool, man. That's really cool to hear how this journey all began. From there, I mean, you went on to go run several ultra marathons, 100-mile races, 200-mile races. What was that like jumping from 100-mile to a 200-mile race? Can you explain how you found out about these 200-mile races and then also share what made you so intrigued by them compared to the 100?
Yeah, so that first 100 I did was in 2017, as we talked about, and then I sort of in my research and nerdiness, I watched all sorts of videos and internet content, and I learned about the Triple Crown of 200s, which is probably the most popularized 200s that people know about,
Yeah.
and that brought that to my attention. I was on trail racing over Texas team at the time, and they were just introducing a 200-mile race in 2019 in El Paso, Texas, which is actually this background here,
Oh, okay.
if anyone can see it. But um, and having run, I don't have it in front of me. I can't remember how many hundreds I'd run at the time. I think 5 or 6 already at this point. I love that distance, and I just wanted to see, sort of that stretch goal again. Now it's a new stretch goal. Okay, I've conquered the 100. Can I do 200? Is this possible? I mean, obviously people do it, and then I wanted to see if I could do it.
Mm. I'm curious. So during these 100-mile races you were doing right before your 200, were these other races you doing? Were the 50Ks, 100Ks, were those easy or easier um, as you've gone along in your running journey because of all the 100 milers you've done? Did those become a lot easier?
Easier to complete, easier
Yeah,
to grind through, but they're not always easy to run. Um, I've had many bad results because they're bad days on the course, but yeah, I would never say it's easy. I don't take even a 50K for granted. Some of them are very hard,
yeah,
um, especially if we're running in a hot, humid Texas. Um, some of the races down here are a challenge just depending on the time of the year. So,
right.
but yes, mentally, it's way easier for me to wrap my head around, which, I mean, I don't want to make light of it for anyone attempting an ultra, but um, my goal is always just to at least finish, and then I'll try and go for a time goal after that. But I always want to finish is my main goal.
Gotcha. Cool, man. I was just curious about that.
Mm.
So I want to touch on the Franklin's 200 miler. I don't believe they do that 200-mile race anymore. Um,
No, no, he advertised it as a one and done in 2020,
mm.
2020 or 2019,
Do
2019.
do you know why
Uh,
they stopped doing it?
well, he did it in conjunction with the Lone Star 100, which was a popular 100-mile race there, and he just did it sort of as an addition to it.
Okay,
Um, and they actually had a good turnout the first year, and then they did it a second year, and then it only existed for 2 years, 2019, 2020,
cool.
which I did both editions, but yeah, it no longer exists, unfortunately, because those very southern tip of the Rocky Mountains in El Paso is gorgeous and yet brutal.
Yeah, it looks like it for sure, man. And so during this time, man, um, you've done all these races, and that's a 2-year gap. I mean, in 2 years, you went from half marathons to a 200-mile race. It looks like.
Yeah, a little
Um,
over 2 years to get up there. Yeah.
so what was that training like during that 2 years, going into doing all these hundreds and 200, and then this 200-mile race? Can you give me like a rough idea of what your days look like whenever you would wake up? Um, Kind of run us through that.
Yeah, so being a family man and full-time regular Joe working person, like I said, I work in the oil service industry. I'm lucky enough to have a sort of an office job now, and a lot of my work's done on the computer, so no longer out in the field, but I work 6 to 8 hours a day, if not more sometimes, and I take care of the family as well. So now I mean, I value consistency more than volume. Um, if you're talking to an average runner, they might consider me high volume, but compared to most ultra runners, I would say I'm just average at best. I run 10 to 12 hours a week, which is maybe an hour a day, a little more on the weekends when I have time. And then I just try and fit in as many races as I could. Because like I said, I don't enjoy the training process. I love the racing because gives me that sense of adventure and just doing something new.
Yeah, so
Because just looking here, that Franklin's would have been my 35th ultra marathon at that point. So in that 2.5 years, I was basically averaging one ultra a month,
wow,
give or take.
yeah. And you were doing right around, I guess, 10, 12 hours would be around 60, 70 miles a week.
Yeah, sometimes I'll peak out more. I mean, I've done plenty of peak weeks in my years, but I don't focus on it. But yeah, probably an average week for me is probably 40 to 70 miles, depending on the week.
Yeah.
You know, average for a ultra marathoner.
I saw on your social media, which you just brought them up. Um, you have a wife and well, it looks like a bunch of little girls.
5 daughters, 5 young
Wow.
daughters. Yes.
So
Yeah. So we're busy at home.
yeah, yeah, it definitely sounds like it. So, um, what? So you're working, you're fitting in training, you're traveling, right? And then you got these five daughters. When, in perspective, when you first started doing this ultra running thing, about how many daughters did you have? How old were they?
Yeah. When I first started, I had 2 daughters. I think our third was either just on the way or shortly after that, but they were only like I think 4 and 2 at the time when I started running. Yep. Just gonna quickly do the math. Yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
about right.
And whenever you started to have more girls, were you? I'm very curious about this. Were you ever? Did you ever have a race planned on the same month that your wife was gonna be due? Is that something you ever worried about as far as having a race run into something like that?
I don't think I ever had one planned,
Okay.
but to be honest, I can't remember.
I was
But
just curious.
no, and I've been there for the birth of all our daughters, so
That's good. That's good. Yeah.
yeah,
I was just
no.
curious about that. So man, I mean,
No, I love running, but I wouldn't skip that. Let's put it that way.
absolutely. So, how's that? How does that work? You know, raising five daughters while doing ultra running and working. What's that work-life balance like?
It's an incredible teamwork with my wife. We're lucky enough that I work and she does I mean, she works full time at home as a homemaker housewife. And, between the two of us, we just balance it out. And she and my daughters are the best support I can have because a lot of the times I go to these races by myself now. It was easier when they were younger. We had only 3 or less daughters and they could go on a short trip, but now it's pretty hard with 5. But once in a while, they'll all come out, and it might get easier later on when they're a little bit more independent. But right now, it's just great teamwork and incredible support from my wife.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, I appreciate you sharing that because I'm sure there's people listening that have kids and maybe they're thinking about doing this whole ultra thing. And so I think that's kind of encouraging for them to know that you're doing it
Oh,
and that they
it
can do
can
it
be
too.
it can be done by anyone. You don't have to do it to my extent and dive way off the deep end like me, but as long as you're open and communicating with your partner, I think you can make it work.
Yeah,
You don't need
absolutely.
the giant 100-mile weeks to get it done. You can run 40, 50 miles and easily get an ultra.
Yeah. And are you doing like any strength training with that?
I have started to do a little bit
Yeah.
in like the last, you know, 2 years here in my early 40s, but honestly, I would put that as a very little to none category on a on a scale if someone gave me an honest questionnaire. So, maybe 15 to 20 minutes uh,
Yeah.
twice a week at best. Maybe once a week is probably what I'm actually doing.
I was just curious. I know a
Yeah.
lot of people really harp on, you know, the strength training and everything. And so I was just curious what you're doing there. And I don't know what you think, but I really think it depends on the person. It just depends physiologically how you,
I completely agree with that too. Listening to the science podcasts and also just personally, I've never been like I've never had any like strains or injuries due to running. Um, so as long as I think I keep consistent and add it, I mean, I think strength training could add benefits,
yeah,
especially living in a flat area helps you for the mountain runs. But
yeah. How
yeah,
is that,
that's right.
dude? So like I talk to a lot of runners that live down south, and whenever I'm talking to them, I ask them about how they train for these mountain races, and I've heard all kinds of crazy stuff, man. Like you name it, I've heard it, man. What are you doing for that? You just kind of winging it, or what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a very popular question when people ask where I'm from and I come to some of these mountain races or,
Yeah,
I do decent in a race and they're like, yeah, how much vert are you running and stuff and they're surprised to hear that very little. But in the past, uh, honestly, a lot of these 50K races around Texas that still relatively compared to other places, they won't give you a lot of vert, but that's kind of what I might use as my vert training once a month when I can be able to get to a run that has some elevation because I'll go on a 15-mile run where I'm from and I'll get maybe 300 feet of elevation. So it's literally flat. The only other option is going to the treadmill. Um, I I don't like that, but I've resorted to it, sort of once a week when I'm building up for some of the bigger ultras.
yeah. And from what it sounds like, man, um, you have deep dived into trail and ultra running and learning about it because you had just mentioned earlier, and I want to backtrack a little bit, how you listen to like a science podcast on strength training. What is some of the most useful information that you've learned over the past however long you've been running?
Well, I don't know what I'd pinpoint as most useful, but I think just listening to all these the science-based podcasts and all the general running podcasts in general, you can absorb all these stories and perspectives and bring it into a personal point of view.
Mm,
Because, like you mentioned before already, it is very individualistic. Um, I've never had a running coach, but I know that's like one of the biggest things they harp on is you need a running coach that's individualized to you, because that's how runners are. Not only your life that goes with the running to fit everything in there, but your genetics and how you adapt and build up. So I think that's probably the biggest thing is I take in all this information. I just see what works for me.
yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, the same applies to diet, um, and really everything. Everything you
Yeah,
just
because
said.
I wouldn't tell someone to do exactly what I do because
Yep.
it may work for them, but it most likely it probably won't. And there's probably something that needs to be changed for them.
Mm,
Um, and same thing, if I tried to copy someone else, the same goes.
yeah, that's very important, and I'm glad we're talking about this. I don't think I've ever heard a podcast say don't copy this or that because it's individualized, but it's very true. It's a fact. I've learned it too because I've absorbed a lot of stuff also. You know, the barefoot running thing. That's another one. By the way, what kind
Yeah.
of shoes are you running in?
Um, I run in all sorts of shoes.
Okay.
Um, I used to have a shoe partnership a few years ago, but that ran out. Now um, I used to be part of a demo program where they send me shoes. Sometimes I get to keep them, so I actually have like 15 to 20 different pairs and probably 10 different brands across them. So I run in anything and everything.
Okay.
But in terms for my races and ultras, I'll use a Hoka or a Ultra. Those are my go-tos for sure.
I feel like those are two widely different shoes. Ultras, big toe box and no drop.
Yeah.
What's that like? How does that work? How do you do that?
So I sort of started with ultras when I first started running without even knowing what zero drop and drop was. So
Yeah.
I didn't really have a transition period. And then ever since then, I've used all sorts of variety of shoes. So I sort of rotate through them and my feet are fine. Um,
Interesting.
yeah.
Dude, your body's just it can take a beating, man. You don't do any weightlifting training really,
The
and you don't
human
have any hit.
body is amazing. It's not just me. It's the human body is adaptive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I rely on my human body to fix itself. Here, I'll give an example, and this is really good. Um, so whenever I was about 4 or 5 years ago, had some thyroid issues, right, from the doctor. They told me to take some medicine. I said, I'm not taking that. My body's just going to figure itself out. Well, 5 years later, I get a blood test. It figured itself out, and my thyroid stuff got solved. It just took time. And it's crazy to think, man. Like, think if you get a cut, your body heals itself. Like the body truly is an amazing masterpiece. It truly is. But some aren't built as strong as others. So they're just genetically they're not as sturdy. You got Canadian bones in you, so
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
built pretty
yeah. My
tough.
my dad grew up as a farmer, and my mom was born and raised in sort of northern Canada, so both got some grit in them as well.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
telling you,
maybe
man.
maybe some partial Canadian genetics in there.
Yeah, that's it, dude. If any single listeners are out there, if you want to have some really good ultra runner babies, just go marry someone in northern Canada. You'll be good to go. Um, but good, yeah, good stuff, man. Yeah, and I want listeners to really understand that, you know, and we've talked about this, but I really want to make this point through that what Trevor does, if you copy him, like this is a big thing. When I first started running, I would follow all these runners on Strava, and I would try to copy their runs that they're doing, right? And I try to copy exactly what they're doing. My diet, like what are they doing, And um, I just figured out just to do my own thing and to screw that. And so I want the listeners to understand that, what works for these people that I talk to on this podcast, what works for Trevor here, might not necessarily work for you. But with that, before we transition to this next segment, Trevor, have you ever heard of Viper Energy?
No, I don't believe I have.
You probably haven't. They're out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they're a new company. I don't know if you drink energy drinks or not, especially during ultras, but they're the sponsor of this podcast, is why I'm going to talk about them real quick.
All
And I'm
right.
going to tell you about them a little bit too. It's a really cool company. So this is for the people watching on YouTube, this is what the can looks like. But what's really unique about this is it has all natural ingredients. The caffeine that's in it is green tea extract. It has a bunch of vitamins in it. It has electrolytes. It has all the EPAs. It's made in the USA. It's owned by some US veterans. And um, it's truly kind of one of the first healthy energy drinks I've ever found. And it tastes good too. Um, so they are the sponsor of this podcast. You can check them out at viperenergy.com. That's VYPER, viperenergy.com. But yeah, man, it's a cool company. So I don't know if you drink any energy drinks during these ultras or not, or need some caffeine, but it's a cool
Yeah,
company.
once in a while, I love my Coca-Cola, especially in
Yeah.
the longer races. But sometimes if they're an energy drink's there, I might sample that instead. So that sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah. It beats all the other ones. It's the first I've ever seen like it. So I just wanted to share that out there. So shout out to those guys. Um, so now I kind of want to hop into what a lot of people are listening to this podcast for, because of the title of this podcast. And I want to talk a little bit about, or really all about, this race you just ran, this Tahoe 200, that took place in Lake Tahoe, California. Um, how'd this race get on your radar?
So like I said, back in 2018, after I fell in love with the sport, I deep dived into the ultra documentaries and YouTube world of, and I think the Triple Crown of 200s was the first time I've heard of it, and that was obviously one of the three by destination trail races. Tahoe, Bigfoot, and Moab. They weren't the first 200 in the U.S., which may or may not be a unknown thing, but there was some controversy on that. But
Mhm.
Candace Burt, the race director, owner of Destination Trail Races, popularized the whole 200 distance. through these three races since I think about 2015
Wow.
or
Yeah.
maybe 14. So they've been around. Actually, this might have been the 10th year for Tahoe. So which of that? Maybe even 2013.
Wow.
So she's the one that popularized the distance before it was well known. And these were sort of the original well-known ones. Other than that, it was sort of grassroots 200-mile races that were like mini loops or something. But these three routes were, Tahoe and Bigfoot are big giant loops, and Moab is basically a giant loop too, I think, with a couple out and back. So they're like non-repeatable 200s, which is a big draw for adventure seekers and ultra runners.
Yeah. Those, I mean, even with outbacks, like you're not seeing the same thing twice. You're seeing it from a different
Yeah,
perspective.
yeah, that's true. I guess I'm speaking in terms of ultra runner who's been in Texas for 5 years. Our parks we have many of them, but they're so small that you're running many of the times you're running the same loop many times over. But so it's
Mhm.
a luxury. I love to see these point to points and out and backs.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, to get back to finish your question, it's sort of always been on my bucket list once I started doing hundreds there in like 2018 and beyond. So it's always been on my list to do, but I've never really been able to fit it in.
Yeah. Well, from what I've seen, I've watched Rob Steger's Triple Crown series that he released a couple years ago.
Yeah,
Um, and I mean, that's one heck of a thing, dude. Like that, I mean, from what I've seen, that's the top feat you can get in ultra running right now, as far as, in America, from what I've seen, is to achieve the Triple Crown. Um, and it's really unique. So for this Tahoe 200, I assume you're running 67 miles a week. Um, is that kind of the same thing?
yeah.
Yeah.
To be honest, I don't even know. Uh, I can I got it open here on my other spreadsheet.
You woke up and ran each day.
Yeah, essentially, I've been on a run streak for nearly 2 years, so I do run every day, even if it's very little. But yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, the week before I ran 52 miles, 67 miles,
Have you
52 miles,
have you ever taken
34 miles.
do you think your body would benefit from taking a month off? Just out of curiosity.
Yes, probably.
Yeah.
Um, people ask me that all the time, but I just truly love it, and it's something that even if I only run my 1 mile a day, I get outside and I feel better after that 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so I mean, no one's paying me to do this sport. So I don't need to be peak performance where I'm competing for a paycheck.
Yeah,
If someone wants to pay me, that'd be great, but I don't see that as a realistic opportunity. So I'm here for the love of the sport.
that's awesome, man. I really respect that and appreciate you sharing that, man. Um, so I can you kind of take us back to the day before this race? You've ran so many of these. Do you still get the race jitters pre-race, like the night before?
I wouldn't say jitters or like anxious, but sort of like maybe restlessness would be a way to put it. Like I'm ready to go. I want to run. I want to race.
Mm,
Opposed to just like sitting there waiting around. Um, I mean the day before this race was packet pickup. I'm currently in Southern California at my in-laws. I drove up the day before Tahoe, which is about a 8.5 hour commute. So I rented a car and drove up by myself. Um, Picked up my bib, and then I slept in my car until the start the next morning.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, just again meet the other runners, and everyone's there and anxious and nervous, and yeah, I'm excited to go run. It's not really nervous because like you said, I've done it so many times that it's I'm not super nervous about a time or anything. My goal is to always just finish. I still want to be competitive and do what I can do, but I don't sweat the small things, especially in these long races, because so many things can happen and do.
Yeah. So, race morning you start. In my mind, I can imagine the first several miles fly by. Is that true?
Yeah, they did pretty well. We had a 9 a.m. start. So it was like basically sunrise was just getting over the mountain. So the heat of the day was just starting.
Yeah.
Um, and actually this year was one of the reasons there was a pretty high drop rate is it was hot during all 3 days. The sun was relentless.
Wow. What was the temperatures?
Nearly 90 degrees is what I was told at certain spots. And when you're up at 7 to 9,000 feet, it feels way hotter than that.
Wow.
I don't know if they have an altitude feel like index, sort of like the humidity index, but it felt closer to 100 for sure.
Yeah, I bet
But
that I bet that was a high impact on your body. I mean, the heat degrades you. Um,
yeah, especially at the altitude too, you're already a little thinner air.
so walk us through from what you remember that first part of the race.
Yeah, so get back to your question here. Yeah, the start, I think there was almost exactly 200 runners at this event. Big mass group start. Everyone's excited. You got that adrenaline flowing. It's first thing in the morning. Everyone's ready to go explore, and yeah, you're around everyone to start with, so you get lots of people to run with on the single track and sort of chit chat, and you're running as slow as you can because you don't want to tire yourself out, and so there's lots of opportunities to meet people or run with people those first while. So everything was pretty smooth for the first while. It was cool exploring the mountains. The first can't remember how many miles were just like 30. So the first 50K was the sort of the longest, highest portion of the race in terms of the altitude. Um, so there was lots of mountain passes. We had to go up and over. Um, Even close above 9,000 feet, we had to go through a few snowdrifts that were still remnant in the shade there, which is always kind of unique in the middle of the summer.
Yeah,
But yeah, it was just it was a nice hot sunny day. There was no clouds in the sky. The energy was there, and it was fun to explore and see the lake from way up on the Tahoe Room Trail there.
yeah. What point of this race did it start to be? Um, I guess you could say game time. Like it started to get serious. It's like, okay, this is starting to hurt now. This is where I'm. This is where the race begins. At what point did that happen?
Well, I'll answer that in two different ways. At what point did it start hurting? Sort of, you know, 50 to 70 miles. Your feet ache. Your joints start to feel it. You want to get off your feet. If anyone's at 100 mile, that's usually around the time when you're like, okay, this is probably good enough. But that's when you got to push through it. To be honest, it's the exact same thing in a 200. It's that same point. The only thing is you're running longer,
Yeah,
and you just got to convince yourself that you're running longer, and the pain never gets worse. It just persists longer. So it's just how you cope with it. So I mean, yeah, it hurt, and you're doing lots of climbing and descending. So as long as you take your time, you don't beat up your legs running downhill, especially early on, because you have so far to go. Um, yeah, and then in terms of like go time in racing, for me that wasn't even on my radar until well into the third day, because I just needed to get to that point and then worry about placement or a time after that.
yeah. And what position were you in at this point in the race? At the middle part of the race?
Yeah, so I sort of run blind. I didn't even like aware. So this let me backtrack for this course. Usually is a full loop around the lake, but 2 years ago there was a forest fire that they
Yeah.
closed one wilderness section, so it was a double out and back. We did 32 miles down and then back, and then the other 72 up and around and back. So we covered 3/4 of the lake, but just in a series of two out and backs.
Okay.
So we did get to see some of the runners, approximately where your position was based on that. And I thought I was, I knew I was close to the top 10, but I didn't know exactly where I was. Um, come to find out later, I was mostly in fourth or fifth, all the way up until third, through most of the race. Um, I think partially because I think a couple people dropped in front of me due to the conditions and the heat, and it just wasn't their day. But I honestly didn't know I was in third until I got to um, one of the aid stations. I think it's called Brockway Summit, and that's like 110 miles into the race. So basically, like 30 some hours into the race is when they told me, "Oh, you're the third person here." It's like, "Oh, really?" And so, I was up there, but I wasn't really aware of it until that point.
Yeah. And, and I can imagine that from what I've learned about you is that you didn't let it affect you. You just kept doing your own race, I assume. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm a competitive person, so it gave me some boost and a little bit of confidence. And it's like, oh, cool. Wonder if I can catch the guys in front of me. Well, it's actually one guy and one girl. We're both crushing in front of me, which they ran away with it. If you see the results,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, it gave me a little bit of motivation because, like I said, my guess would have been I'd been in seventh or eighth, but volunteers told me I was in third. I was like, oh, cool. But it also reassured me that I was doing the right thing by just running my own race, sort of like you said, and eating and sleeping the best I could to keep moving at my race pace.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean it's very impressive considering, you know, you ended up finishing seventh overall, but it's very impressive considering you're from Sugarland, Texas, you know, flat. And you know, not too many miles per week. And so kudos to you on that, man. That's very impressive. And it's just that Canadian in you. So but what was I always like to hear about, you know, some of the hallucination stories. Did you have any of those?
So this time I actually did. I've only actually had one other hallucination experience, and that was in my first 200, and I really experienced sleep deprivation for the first time. But since I haven't had too many at all, because I've sort of, I guess I've preventative slept before that. But this time around, I had visual hallucinations. Um, but it was really weird because, um, like you mentioned, training for Ultra Series, you could sort of see him hallucinating a little bit there on the film, where he would like see things, but he was like completely out of it from lack of sleep. Um, whereas I was experiencing seeing sort of like people, statues, and animals out of the trees and rocks ahead of me,
Mm,
mainly at night. Um, this was sort of like on the third day and third night, sort of the last 24 hours of the race, and I I could my brain was telling me they could see him, but I was so lucid and aware enough that I knew it wasn't real that I would just like I just went with it. I could, and as I got closer to that tree, I could tell oh no, I could see why it might look like that, but it's just a tree shaped like whatever. So I saw lots of like animals sitting on the side of the trail, but it was actually just a rock shaped like whatever.
yeah.
So, but that was kind of a unique experience for me because I was so lucid, but my brain was craving that reset, that REM sleep to reset. That it was just sort of I would describe it as dreaming as awake. You see these things, but you know they're not there.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
you can't tell your brain not to see it. Your brain sees it, and you're like, and it's the other way around. You're like, no, that's not real.
Yeah.
I'm in the middle of the woods.
Yeah. The brain's very a very interesting thing. The dreams are crazy. Hallucinations. Very interesting rabbit hole right there. Um, so did you how often did you sleep during this race? At what points did you sleep?
Yeah, so I was actually just jotting some notes down earlier today for my race report I'll ultimately write. But so before this hallucination on the third day, um, like I said, so the first like 48 hours, I think I did really well on sleep. So after 34 hours, 35 hours, is when I took my first sleep. I ran through the whole first night, um, and that was sort of on plan if I could do it, um, which I managed to this time without getting too sleepy. So I did. I slept for about 1 hour the first time. Then I went another 40 miles, um, basically almost another full 12, 15 hours. Can't remember how long it was. And then I slept for 15 minutes. And then I did one other sleep in the shade in the heat of the day for 20 minutes. So there's about what's that? An hour and 30 minutes over the first 48 hours. And it worked out for me. I was still alert, and those were like preventative sleeps, as I would put it. I wasn't hallucinating, wasn't tripping over myself yet. Um, but that third night, when I started seeing these visual hallucinations, I knew my brain was tired and it needed a reset. And so, but this was also when I was trying to keep that higher position that I think I was in third or fourth at the time. Um, I mean, the last four sleeps didn't come until the last 20 miles of the race. I had four dirt naps in the last 20 miles, which I can't even tell you how long that actually took me. I'd have to look that up, but it was very slow. It was in over the last third night, and I tried to sleep basically in 10 to 15-minute intervals four different times, um, and it didn't work to reset my brain, which is what the goal was. Because every time I would just still keep feeling very tired and whatnot. So in total, I came up with about 2.5 hours of sleep in just under 3 days of running there. 71 hours and 20 minutes total.
That's insane, man.
Yeah.
That's not a
So
lot of sleep.
I mean,
Wow.
ideally, it worked great. The only thing I
Yeah.
would change is I would maybe sleep for a full 60 to 90 minutes, which is what I found works for me, which is sort of one REM cycle of sleep. Before that third night, if I did that preventatively, I probably wouldn't have needed all those dirt naps, and I probably would have actually moved faster than I was actually death marching through that last night.
Yeah.
But that's uh, that's the great thing. You always learn new things every time. So
Yeah. I've heard of the new McKnight strategy of sleeping early because McKnight in the Kokoda 250 slept um for a little bit in the first night or so of the race, and then he crushed the last half. Um, did you ever think about doing a strategy similar to that, or is that too different for you?
well, based on my experience, I sort of think that it might be beneficial to sort of do that one sleep period per night. Um, Especially looking back on, I mean, I'm very happy with only 2.5 hours of sleep, but that third night sort of killed my time and and my pace. So maybe it's not ideal, but I mean, yeah, I think one block of sleep per night is probably ideal for most people or people at the aiming for a certain goal.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah. It's always really interesting to hear about the sleeping stories of these 250-mile finishers like you. So it's
yeah,
really
and that's one of the big things about these 200s right now is there is no quote unquote set sleeping strategy that works yet
Yeah.
that people can even sort of to say, yes, this is how you do it, copy that, or take a derivative of this to make it work for yourself. I mean, everyone still tries many different things. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like a bunch of guessing. You're just kind of guessing when you're out there.
but
Um,
yeah, it's completely individualized because I mean, I finished in just under 3 days. The race lasted 5 days, so there's people running 2 more full days than I did. So
wow.
you really need to know what your body needs in order to get the distance done.
Yeah. Uh, what are what are some of the big highlights of the race, you would say? The over the course of this, 200 miles.
Probably the biggest highlight is just the scenic aspect of this course. It was basically gorgeous the whole way. We did the double out and back, like I said, so the lake was on your one side the entire time, and the wild forest and mountains are on you're in them and on the other side of you. So it's pretty cool. And then getting to the far turnaround point of the course, I was there in the middle of the night, but then coming back a little bit, I was up on this plateau where you could see back, and you just look across the entire Lake Tahoe, and you can see this lights on the other side. I don't know what it is by a crow flies, probably 50 or 70 miles, but you could see the lights on the other side of the lake, and you're like, that's where I came from. That's where I still have to run to. But it's pretty cool just to like realize that you got there on your own 2 feet, and just the immenseness of the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wonder what people back in the 1800s would think about what we're doing nowadays. It's kind of a wild to think about from an outside perspective like that.
Yeah, they'd be wondering why we're doing it for fun when they had to do it for various other reasons or something.
Yeah, yeah, that's for sure. Um, and so when you finished this race, you crossed that finish line, what was that like?
Oh, it's a great sense of relief. What I had a initial time goal of aiming for 65 hours, but that sort of went out the window there a little bit. So my next time goal, once I got into that third night, was to finish sub 3 days, so 72 hours. So that was my draw, and even with all my missteps and dirt naps in that last 20 miles there, I managed to squeak under in 71 hours and 20 minutes. Um, so it was great. I was happy to get off my feet and get it done, and it's always cool to cross the finish line.
Yeah, and you get that buckle. And have you done the Triple Crown, or is this a part of the Triple Crown you're doing as far as doing them all?
No, I have not done the Triple Crown, and no, I'm not doing it this year.
Okay.
I would love to do it at some point, but it requires time, money, and time off
Yeah.
to make it all work. So,
Okay. I was just
but
curious on that.
yeah, I would love to do it. I'm doing my own Triple Crown of 200s this year in a different way, not the Destination Trail ones, but yeah, I've done two. This was my second 200 this year, and I have one more coming up in September. So, in a sense, I am
Yeah.
just my own way.
Yeah. It counts. We'll say it counts. So, what's w- after doing this race? I mean, we're not too long after you completing the race. Um, what is the recovery like, the sleep like? You finished. Did you go sleep?
Yeah, so I finished just under 72 hours. Like I said, we started at 9 a.m. So when I finished, it was like 8:20 a.m. When I got in. So the sun was just coming up. Um, I was coming off, stumbling through the night, trying to reset my brain there. So I was clearly tired. But the sun was coming up, so that sort of kicks in your circadian rhythm, say, okay, now it's time to stay awake. Um, but I had no problem. I got in some food right away, got off my feet, sat in a chair, chatted with a few of the other runners that were still awake enough to chat, and then I they had some cots there at the lodge where it was hosted, and I went and laid down for a couple hours. But yeah, immediately after these ultras, it's easy to fall asleep, but it's very hard to stay asleep very long. So I think I slept for maybe 6 hours that entire day, but probably over 3 or 4 different sessions.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard that, after you run these distances that you don't get as good sleep as you think you do, or you think you will.
Well, you get good sleep, but it's very broken up. Like it's not, you can't sleep for 8 hours, is how I'd say.
Okay.
You get that one cycle of sleep, and then your body's like, oh, we got to get up. We're still running until you convince your body, no, we're done. We're not doing this anymore. You can rest.
Yeah. 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 That's super neat, man. So I'm gonna ask you two pieces of advice for two different groups of people. We'll start with the first one. Anyone who's listening that's thinking about running this race or plans on doing it next year or whenever, what advice do you have for them?
So a couple of quick pieces of advice. I'd say consistency in training. Like, don't worry about super high mileages, but I mean, if you got a coach and you got targets and goal times, I'm sure you're already working on that. But anyone can do this. Um, it's at moderate altitude. This race takes place between 6,500 up to 9,600 was the peak summit. So it's that mid altitude range that some people start to get altitude sickness. That's more individualized too. So
Yeah.
just be aware of that. If you've never run at altitude before, just know that it's going to slow you down no matter who you are. um, I mean, it slows everyone down, just depends on how much. So, but yeah, don't hesitate, sign up, take on the journey. It's they give you 5 days to get it done, which I think is equivalent to 2 miles an hour. So when you break it down to that, and yes, it's still incredibly hard to do, but it's incredibly rewarding and epic journey to get it done.
Yeah. And what advice do you have for just people out there in general when it comes to trail and ultra running?
Probably more of the same thing, just enjoy it. I mean, the sport is slowly getting more professionalized, which is kind of cool to see. I hope the local races don't take away the grassroots stuff too much, but because it's so much fun just to get out and run with your communities. But big trail community out here, ultra trail community all across the states, and if you run enough of these ultras, you start seeing the same people at different races across the different states even, and it's kind of cool. And it's a welcoming community. If you've never tried it, just go out and try it. We don't care what your time is. No one does. They usually ask you how your race was. They don't start off with what was your time. So don't
Yeah.
don't fret the small stuff.
Good stuff, man. Good stuff. I saw that little shot you had at the road runners there with the time. But yeah, good advice, man. Good advice. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. Um, and before we in the podcast segment here, do you have any sponsors or any brands you represent?
Yeah, I run for Rabbit. I've been on the Rabbit Elite Trail team for the last few years. It's a great apparel company. If you haven't tried them, they're made here in the USA, based out in California. Women-led and founded company. They make the great trail running gear, all sorts of stuff, and yeah, best gear there is. And thankful for their support over the last few years. And then also an ambassador for Athletic Brewing, non-alcoholic craft brews. If anyone's looking for an alternative, can crush a few of these right after you run an ultra.
Sweet. Well, I appreciate it, man, and thanks for joining us.